I'm Daria Henry. I'm 28 years old, and last night I found myself standing in a freezing brick garage while a Michigan blizzard raged outside. The temperature was 8 degrees. Through the frosted window, I could see the glow of the stone fireplace in the living room. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, had just locked the door. She stood on the warm side of the glass, pointed a manicured finger at me, and said, "If you cannot contribute money, you do not deserve a bed in this house. Go sleep in the garage." My husband, Ethan, watched the whole thing from the velvet sofa and never said a word. He just let his mother throw me into the sub-zero snowstorm because they thought I had just lost my job. They thought I was broke, powerless, and at their mercy. But they had no idea who they had just banished. Before I tell you how I dismantled their fake aristocratic lives in exactly 4 days, welcome to Grape Echo Stories. If you hate toxic in-laws as much as I do, take a second to hit that like and subscribe button, and drop a comment below telling me your age and where you are watching from tonight. Now, let me take you back 4 hours to the moment my husband's family made the biggest mistake of their lives. I had just driven back to Grosse Pointe from my office in downtown Detroit. I work as the chief architect of quantum computing systems at a major research institute. My career pays very well, a fact Beatrice relied on to fund her elite country club memberships and maintain the illusion of old money wealth. I walked through the front door of our historic Tudor mansion, shaking the snow off my wool coat. Ethan and Beatrice were sitting by the grand hearth. Beatrice was holding a glass of sherry, complaining about the legacy dues at the yacht club. I stood in the foyer and delivered the news from my board meeting. I told them my research division was undergoing an emergency corporate merger. I explained that my department was temporarily dissolved pending the restructuring. The silence in the room became suffocating. Beatrice lowered her glass. Her polished society smile vanished. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask what my next move would be. She stood up, her cashmere shawl slipping to the floor. She stared at me with pure disgust and asked if I was unemployed. I explained it was a pause, but Beatrice was already panicking. Her social survival in this zip code required constant cash flow, cash she secretly relied on me to provide. Her voice turned sharp and frantic. She reminded me about the upcoming winter gala and Ethan's pending club fees. Then she demanded I hand over the login credentials to my private savings account, the one account I kept separate from my husband. I looked at Ethan. We had been married for 4 years. He sat frozen on the couch, studying the intricate patterns on the Persian rug. I told Beatrice my savings were staying exactly where they were. Her jaw tightened. She marched toward me, grabbed my suitcase from the hallway closet, and shoved it against my chest. She told me I was a useless burden. She pointed to the side door leading out to the detached garage. She delivered her ultimatum: hand over the savings or freeze. I waited for Ethan to stand up. I waited for him to defend his wife. He simply shifted his weight and looked away. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly walked upstairs, packed my essential electronics and a change of clothes into the suitcase. I walked back down the stairs, past the blazing fire, past my cowardly husband, and stepped out into the blinding snowstorm. I stood in the freezing garage just long enough to order a private car. I checked into a luxury hotel downtown, opened my encrypted laptop, and prepared to show them exactly what happens when you try to freeze out a quantum architect. The private car dropped me off at the entrance of a high-end luxury hotel in downtown Detroit. I tipped the driver, grabbed my single leather suitcase, and walked through the sliding glass doors. The rich scent of cedarwood and the warm circulating air instantly began to thaw the chill from my bones. I approached the front desk and booked their top-floor executive suite for the rest of the week. The concierge handed me the key card without asking any questions. She did not see a desperate, unemployed woman seeking shelter from a blizzard. She saw a calm, focused professional holding a black card. Upstairs, the suite was a quiet sanctuary of dark mahogany furniture and soft recessed lighting. I walked over to the digital thermostat and pushed the temperature up to 74 degrees. Then I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar, set it on the heavy oak desk, and pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag. The glowing screen was my true domain. Beatrice and Ethan thought my worth was tied to a standard biweekly paycheck. They understood nothing about the tech industry, corporate equity, or the true value of quantum architecture. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed 3 layers of biometric security to access my primary offshore banking portal. The corporate merger I had mentioned back in the living room was not a tragedy. It was a victory. When 2 global tech giants absorb a highly specialized quantum computing research division, the chief architect does not get a pink slip. They get an executive restructuring buyout. The page refreshed, displaying the new balance in my portfolio. An 8-figure sum sat quietly on the digital ledger. The numbers glowed in the dim room, a silent testament to my real leverage. I was not broke. I was liberated. I possessed more liquid capital than the entire Grosse Pointe Yacht Club combined. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city. I earned every academic scholarship and fought for every research grant. Ethan grew up attending elite private prep schools, coasting through life on the fading glory of his family name. He always treated my technology career like a cute hobby. Beatrice treated it like a pedestrian chore. They worshipped old money legacy and social status, oblivious to the fact that modern innovation is what actually dictates power. I opened a hidden, password-protected folder labeled Real Estate. Inside was a digitized PDF of a property deed. The address listed on the document was the very same historic Tudor mansion I had just been kicked out of. 2 years ago, Beatrice had faced a humiliating financial crisis. Her late husband had left her buried in hidden debt, and the bank was weeks away from initiating a public foreclosure. She would have lost her status, her country club access, and her mind. She came to me crying, begging for a loan, and swearing me to strict secrecy. I did not just hand her a check to pay her mortgage. I set up a blind holding company, a private LLC, and purchased the property outright from the bank. Beatrice then lied to Ethan and her high society friends. She told everyone she had masterfully refinanced the estate through an exclusive private broker. Ethan still believed his mother owned the walls he slept inside. He had no idea his wife was their landlord. Tonight, Beatrice had locked me out of my own home. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. She had banished the only person keeping a roof over her head. I decided to review my secondary accounts, curious to see how long Ethan and Beatrice could survive without my routine direct deposits buffering their expenses. I navigated to the joint high-yield investment portfolio I shared with Ethan. We maintained that specific account for emergency liquid funds and future family planning. I expected to see the standard 6-figure balance resting safely in the mutual funds. Instead, the dashboard loaded to reveal a glaring red 0. My heart skipped a beat. It was not out of panic, but out of sheer disbelief. I clicked on the transaction history, my eyes scanning the rows of data. 2 weeks ago, the entire balance had been liquidated. The funds were transferred out to a separate checking account that I did not recognize. I switched into forensic mode. I pulled up the official withdrawal authorization forms provided by the bank. Any external transfer over $10,000 required dual signatures from both account holders. I zoomed in on the digital scan of the paperwork. There was Ethan's messy scrawl on the bottom line. Right next to it was my signature. Except I had never signed that piece of paper. I stared at the strokes of the pen. The loop on the D was too sharp. The slant of the H was too forced. Ethan had forged my name. My own husband had committed systemic wire fraud to bypass the banking security protocols. I ran a swift trace on the routing numbers for the mystery checking account. It took me less than 5 minutes to crack the digital trail. The money did not go toward our shared investments. It did not go toward any household repairs or joint expenses. Ethan had wired the stolen funds directly to Beatrice. I accessed public tax records and cross-referenced the vendor payments from that shell account. The evidence painted a pathetic picture. The money went to pay off Beatrice's delinquent premium credit cards, her luxury car lease, and a hefty advance payment on our upcoming yacht club winter gala tickets. Ethan had robbed his own wife to fund his mother's delusion of grandeur. The coldness I had felt standing in the brick garage returned, but this time it was radiating from within my own chest. Ethan had sat on that velvet sofa just hours ago. He watched his mother condemn me to the freezing cold, knowing full well he had just stolen my financial safety net. He let her call me a useless burden, while my forged signature paid for the very sherry she was drinking. This was no longer just about a toxic mother-in-law overstepping her bounds. This was financial infidelity. This was a calculated criminal betrayal by the man who swore to protect and respect me. I leaned back in the plush leather chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the snowy Detroit skyline. The blizzard was still raging outside, burying the city under layers of white ice. Beatrice wanted to play a ruthless game of survival and status. Ethan wanted to play the role of the dutiful son while quietly picking my pockets. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, and so much more. I began compiling the digital wire transfer receipts, the forged signature scans, and the original property deed into a new master folder on my desktop. I named the folder Eviction. I had promised myself I would give them 4 days to realize their mistake. But I needed them to feel secure first. I needed them to become arrogant. To spring a flawless trap, the prey must truly believe they have already won the game. I picked up my smartphone and set an alarm for 8 o'clock in the morning. Tomorrow, I would execute the first phase of my plan. I would make a very special phone call to my husband. I would pretend to be broken, freezing, and desperate. I would pretend my hotel credit card was declined. I would feed their towering egos until they choked on their own pride. The alarm on my smartphone chimed exactly at 8 o'clock. Sunlight pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite. The Detroit skyline was a frozen painting of silver steel and white ice. I stepped out of the warm sheets and walked over to the glass. Down below, the city was waking up, snowplows clearing the heavy drifts from the avenues. I felt rested. I felt dangerous. Today required a flawless performance. The most crucial element of any trap is the illusion of safety. If my husband and his mother suspected I possessed millions in liquid capital, they would hire defense attorneys immediately. They would scramble to cover their tracks. They would hide the money they stole from my accounts. I needed them complacent. I needed them to believe their cruel garage ultimatum had worked perfectly. I needed them to think I was a broken, desperate woman crawling back for scraps. I walked into the marble bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I practiced my expression. I let my shoulders droop. I softened my gaze. I cleared my throat several times, forcing a dry, raspy sound into my vocal cords. I needed to sound like I had spent the night shivering, crying, and panicking. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I had called every day for the last 4 years. It rang 3 times. Ethan answered. The connection opened, and immediately I heard the clinking of fine silverware in the background. They were eating breakfast in the formal dining room. The dining room inside the Tudor mansion that my holding company legally owned. "What do you want, Daria?" Ethan asked. His tone was clipped, annoyed, and laced with unearned superiority. I inhaled a shaky breath. I forced my voice to tremble. "Ethan, please, do not hang up. I need your help." A heavy pause followed. I could picture him sitting at the long mahogany table, puffing out his chest, seeking approval from the woman sitting across from him. "I thought you were packing your bags and leaving us behind," he replied. "You seemed pretty confident walking out the door last night." "I made a terrible mistake," I whispered, letting a fake sob catch in my throat. I checked into a hotel downtown. They required a card on file for incidentals. I tried to use my debit card, but the transaction was declined. The corporate merger locked down my accounts. Everything is frozen. I have $10 in my wallet. I listened closely to the silence on the line. I was handing him a script, waiting to see if he would read his lines. "Declined," Ethan repeated. A soft chuckle escaped his lips. The sound made my stomach turn, but I maintained my fragile character. "They are going to ask me to leave the room by noon if I cannot provide a working card," I pleaded. I just need a temporary loan. $500, Ethan, just to cover the room and some food until the banks open on Monday. Please, it is below zero outside." In the background, a chair scraped against the hardwood floor. My mother-in-law spoke up. Her voice was sharp enough to cut through the phone speaker, dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Tell her no." She chose to walk out. Let her learn what the real world costs. Ethan sighed into the receiver, adopting the tone of a disappointed parent lecturing a disobedient child. "You hear that, Daria. My mother is right. You have always been so careless with your priorities. You thought your little technology job made you invincible. You thought you could disrespect the family hierarchy and just waltz out the door." I dug my fingernails into my palm to stop myself from laughing. My husband was lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. This was the same man who had forged my signature on banking documents to liquidate a high-yield investment portfolio. He was standing on floors I paid for, eating food bought with my stolen money, calling me careless. He was performing for his mother, eager to prove he could control his insubordinate wife. "Ethan, please," I whimpered. "I do not know where else to go." "You should have thought about that before you acted so proud," he sneered. "We are not a charity. Maybe sitting in a cold lobby will teach you some respect. Do not call back until you are ready to apologize to my mother and contribute to this household." He ended the call. The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The fragile, trembling persona vanished in an instant. I smiled. A genuine, terrifying smile. The red herring had been swallowed whole. They took the bait without a single second of hesitation. Their towering egos had blinded them to any logical inconsistencies. They did not question why a quantum computing architect would have frozen accounts. They did not wonder if I had retained a legal team. They simply heard the desperation in my voice and absorbed it like a drug. By playing the helpless victim, I had achieved exactly what I set out to do. They were now secure in their false victory. They believed they held all the power. They would take reckless risks, assuming I was too busy begging for survival to notice their ongoing fraud. I walked back into the main suite and sat down at the heavy oak desk. I opened my encrypted laptop. The digital forensic dossier was waiting for me. I needed to ensure the chain of custody for the financial evidence was ironclad. Compiling this data was just like writing architectural code. Every variable had to be accounted for. Every string of logic had to be unbreakable. My corporate estate attorney, Jonathan, had taught me long ago that courts do not care about hurt feelings. They only care about paper trails. I downloaded the metadata from the forged withdrawal slip. I pulled the IP logs from the bank transfer, cross-referencing the timestamps with the wireless router at the Grosse Pointe mansion. Ethan had executed the wire fraud from his own home office. He did not even bother to use a virtual private network. His digital footprint was a glowing neon sign pointing directly to a federal indictment. I categorized every receipt, every timestamp, and every hidden transaction into a pristine legal file. I saved the files onto a secure, encrypted flash drive, a sleek silver device that held the keys to my architectural algorithms and my personal wealth. I slipped the drive into my jacket pocket. The financial trap was fully armed, but I needed to tighten the social noose around my mother-in-law. Stripping them of their stolen funds would hurt, but stripping them of their aristocratic status would destroy them. My husband's mother ruled her social circle through fear, exclusivity, and the illusion of immense wealth. She wielded her legacy name like a weapon at the yacht club. But she had made enemies over the years. She treated anyone outside her legacy bloodline like dirt on the bottom of her designer shoes. She thought her victims suffered in silence. She was wrong. I closed my laptop and walked over to the closet. I traded my soft hotel robe for a tailored charcoal suit and a heavy cashmere trench coat. I tied my hair back into a sleek knot. I was done playing the shivering, discarded wife. I had a lunch meeting scheduled at a private club across town. I was going to meet a woman who despised my husband's family just as much as I did. A woman who had endured years of insults and exclusion from the legacy wives, Ethan's estranged sister-in-law. She possessed the insider knowledge I needed to dismantle their country club facade. They thought I was alone in this freezing city. They were about to learn that shared hatred forms the strongest alliances. I picked up my keys and walked out the door, ready to strike the next match. The snowstorm had finally broken, leaving downtown Detroit buried under a thick layer of ice. I navigated my rental sedan through the slush-filled streets, pulling up to the valet stand of the Renaissance Club. The private establishment was a sanctuary for the city's true power brokers. It catered to corporate executives, tech innovators, and hedge fund managers. It was a place built on actual capital, unlike the legacy yacht clubs in Grosse Pointe that relied on dusty family names and inherited prestige. I handed my keys to the attendant and stepped inside the grand lobby. The air smelled of roasted espresso and expensive leather. I walked past the mahogany bar and headed toward a secluded booth in the back corner. Valerie was already waiting. Valerie was married to my husband's older brother. She was a brilliant corporate strategist who specialized in hostile takeovers and company restructuring. She possessed a sharp analytical mind that intimidated everyone in her orbit. Beatrice despised her. My mother-in-law had spent years trying to drive a wedge between Valerie and the rest of the family. Beatrice hated Valerie because Valerie did not come from old money. Valerie built her own empire from the ground up. She saw right through the fake aristocratic facade Beatrice projected, and Beatrice punished her for it, with endless passive-aggressive insults and exclusion from every major social event. Valerie and her husband eventually cut ties with the toxic matriarch, opting for a life of peace over constant manipulation. I slid into the leather booth across from her. Valerie took a sip of her black coffee and studied my face. She did not offer empty sympathies about my sudden departure from the Tudor mansion. She dealt in facts, strategy, and execution. "You look entirely too calm for a woman who was kicked out into a blizzard last night," Valerie observed. Her voice was smooth and calculated. I ordered a green tea from the passing waiter before answering. "I am not homeless Valerie. I am merely relocating my assets." A knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. She opened her designer briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the polished wooden table. She told me she had been keeping tabs on Beatrice for years. When Beatrice tried to ruin her son's credit score to fund a lavish trip to Europe a decade ago, Valerie initiated a quiet financial surveillance operation. She told me Beatrice was drowning. I unclasped the envelope and pulled out a stack of printed financial ledgers. I explained to Valerie that I already knew about the stolen investment funds. I told her Ethan had forged my signature to pay off his mother's premium credit cards and her upcoming winter gala tickets. Valerie shook her head. Her expression turned grim. "The credit cards are just the surface, Daria. Beatrice has a much deeper problem. Look at the highlighted routing numbers on the third page." I flipped to the document and scanned the digits. The transfers were large, systematic, and directed to an unlisted holding company operating out of a warehouse district in the city. I asked Valerie who owned the accounts. She leaned forward, lowering her voice over the soft jazz playing in the restaurant. Beatrice did not just max out her credit limits. She borrowed a substantial sum from an underground tech broker who doubles as a predatory lender. 6 months ago, she tried to invest in a speculative real estate venture to boost her dwindling social portfolio. The venture collapsed. To cover her tracks and maintain her yacht club status, she took a high-interest loan from very dangerous people. The money Ethan stole from your joint account did not go toward luxury car leases. It went toward paying the compounding interest on a debt they can never escape. I stared at the numbers on the page. The plot twist settled over me like a heavy winter chill. My husband was not just committing white-collar fraud to spoil his mother. He was stealing my money to keep a criminal syndicate away from their doorstep. They were reckless, desperate, and legally doomed. The stakes had elevated far beyond a simple domestic dispute. I folded the documents and placed them inside my coat pocket. I looked Valerie in the eyes and thanked her for the intelligence. I told her I was going to dismantle their entire lives by the end of the week. I was going to expose the fraud, evict them from the historic mansion, and ensure Beatrice lost the one thing she valued above all else, her social standing. Valerie leaned back in her chair. She told me Beatrice derived all her power from her legacy spot at the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club. That membership was her shield and her crown. As long as she held that title, the society wives would continue to worship her. I took a slow sip of my tea. I told Valerie that the yacht club membership was currently delinquent. Beatrice was tens of thousands of dollars in arrears, and the club treasurer was losing patience. I had been quietly serving as the financial guarantor for that account. I informed Valerie that I was withdrawing my guarantee today. The club would demand immediate payment. Then I offered Valerie a pact, a silent, formidable agreement between two women who had endured years of unearned disrespect. I told her I was not just seeking retribution. I was going to purchase Beatrice's legacy spot. I was going to pay the arrears in full, buy the exclusive membership out from under her, and transfer the title directly into Valerie's name. Valerie stared at me, her eyes widening slightly as the magnitude of the offer registered. I was promising her the ultimate societal payoff. I was going to force Beatrice to watch the woman she marginalized step into her throne. It was poetic brutal and perfectly calibrated to destroy my mother-in-law's ego. Valerie extended her hand across the table. We shook on it. The alliance was cemented. Just as the waiter returned to clear our cups, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the new message illuminated on the screen. It was a text from Ethan. The tone of his message was entirely different from our phone call this morning. He sounded urgent, almost panicked. He wrote that he had been thinking about my financial situation. He claimed he wanted to come to my hotel this afternoon to help me secure a new job. He suggested I hand over my proprietary quantum architecture files so he could forward them to a corporate recruiter he knew in the city. I read the message twice. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. My husband, who had spent years mocking my career, suddenly wanted access to my highly classified technological property. I remembered the loan shark debt Valerie had just uncovered. Ethan was not trying to help me find a job. He was planning to steal my algorithms. He intended to fence my intellectual property on the black market to pay off the dangerous men his mother owed. I touched the encrypted flash drive resting safely in my other pocket. The silver device held a decoy algorithm laced with aggressive tracking software. My enemies thought they were closing in for the kill. They had no idea they were walking straight into a federal snare. I typed a quick reply telling my husband I would be waiting for him in the lobby. The game was escalating. I returned to the luxury hotel just as the afternoon sky turned the color of bruised iron. The winter storm had paused, but the air remained bitterly cold. I rode the glass elevator up to my executive suite, the silence of the ascending cab a stark contrast to the racing thoughts in my mind. Valerie had given me the missing puzzle piece. My husband and his mother were not just social climbers hiding bad credit. They were debtors to a criminal syndicate. This elevated my strategy from a simple divorce settlement to a calculated takedown. I walked into my room, locked the deadbolt, and retrieved a sleek silver object from my leather bag. It was a standard encrypted flash drive. To anyone else, it looked like a simple piece of office equipment. But Ethan knew exactly what it was. I had carried a version of this drive on my keychain since my days in graduate school. It was the physical vessel for my life's work. Over the years, Ethan used to joke about it at dinner parties, telling his friends that my little science projects were stored on that tiny piece of metal. He always spoke about my career with a condescending chuckle, treating my quantum computing research like an eccentric hobby. He never understood the sheer power of the architectural algorithms contained within that silver casing. Now that same device was going to be the instrument of his downfall. I sat at the oak desk and inserted the drive into my laptop. I began the process of compartmentalizing my genuine files. I transferred the actual quantum logic gates, the classified blueprints, and the proprietary patents into a heavily guarded cloud vault. Once the physical drive was wiped clean, I uploaded a specialized decoy file. I had coded this specific sequence months ago as an internal security test for the Research Institute. To the untrained eye, the digital architecture appeared to be a revolutionary breakthrough in data processing. It looked like a billion-dollar patent waiting to be claimed. But hidden beneath the surface of the fake code was a silent, lethal script. It was a telemetry beacon. The moment a foreign computer attempted to open the primary folder, the hidden script would execute in the background. It would instantly map the host network, capture the device serial numbers, record every single keystroke, and bypass standard firewalls to transmit the data directly to my secure server. It was a digital bear trap. Whoever plugged this drive into their machine was committing undeniable, federally traceable wire fraud. I ejected the silver device and placed it carefully on the center of the desk. 30 minutes later, a sharp knock echoed through the suite. I walked over to the door and checked the peephole. Ethan was standing in the hallway. He was wearing his expensive camel hair coat, his hair perfectly styled, his posture reeking of unearned confidence. He looked like a man who had everything under control. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door. Ethan stepped into the warm room, brushing a few stray snowflakes from his lapel. His eyes darted around the luxurious suite, taking in the mahogany furniture and the sweeping views of the Detroit skyline. I could see a brief flicker of resentment in his gaze. He hated that I was staying in a place nicer than the Tudor mansion. But he quickly masked his jealousy behind a practiced expression of deep concern. He walked toward me and reached out, placing his hands on my shoulders. I had to force myself not to pull away from his touch. "I have been worried about you, Daria," he said softly. His voice dripped with fake empathy. The performance was nauseating. This was the same man who had sat silently on a velvet sofa while his mother banished me to a freezing brick garage just 24 hours ago. I looked down at the floor, playing the role of the shattered, vulnerable wife. I told him the night had been difficult. I repeated the lie about my frozen accounts and my desperate situation. Ethan offered a sympathetic nod, rubbing his thumb against his gold wedding band. That gesture was his ultimate tell. Whenever Ethan lied, he anchored himself to the symbol of our marriage. "I came here because I want to help you fix this," he continued, adopting the tone of a benevolent savior. "My mother was harsh last night, but she is under a lot of stress. We all are. You need to get back on your feet quickly. You need an income, Daria." I reached out to a corporate recruiter I know in the city. He specializes in placing tech executives. I looked up, widening my eyes in feigned gratitude. "You did that for me, Ethan?" "Of course I did," he smiled, a greasy, self-satisfied smirk. "We are family." "But the recruiter needs to see your portfolio today. He needs your proprietary architectural files to prove your value to the competing firms. Send me your algorithms, and I will make sure he fast-tracks your application." I let a hesitant sigh escape my lips. I explained that the files were far too large and heavily encrypted to send over a standard email server. I told him they required a physical transfer. I walked over to the oak desk and picked up the silver flash drive. The metal felt cold against my palm. I turned back to my husband and held it out. "Everything is on here," I whispered, injecting a note of fearful hesitation into my voice. "This is my entire career, Ethan. This is everything I have built. Please be careful with it." Ethan snatched the drive from my hand with terrifying speed. His eyes lit up with raw greed. He did not care about my career. He did not care about a fake corporate recruiter. He was staring at what he believed was his salvation. He thought he was holding millions of dollars in stolen intellectual property. He thought he was holding the golden ticket that would pay off his mother's loan shark and secure his legacy forever. "I will guard it with my life, Daria," he promised, slipping the silver drive into the inner pocket of his coat. "Just sit tight. Let me handle the business side of things. I will call you tonight when I have good news." He leaned in and kissed my cheek. His lips felt like ice. He turned and walked out the door without looking back, his pace quickening as he headed for the elevator. He was so eager to cash in his stolen prize. He thought he was a mastermind, executing the perfect corporate heist. He had no idea he was a pawn, stepping directly into a federal snare. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. The pathetic, grateful persona evaporated instantly. I walked back to the oak desk, poured a glass of sparkling water, and opened my laptop. I launched the secure tracking dashboard and maximized the window on my screen. The interface was dark, displaying a blank grid, waiting for a signal. Now the waiting game began. I sat in the silent suite, watching the digital clock in the corner of my screen tick away the minutes. Ethan was driving back to the suburbs. He was going to find a quiet room, open his computer, and try to sell my life's work. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. I took a slow sip of water, keeping my eyes fixed on the blank dashboard. An hour passed. The sun dipped lower over the frozen city, casting long shadows across the hotel suite. Suddenly, a sharp ping echoed from my computer speakers. The dark screen flared to life. Lines of green code began scrolling rapidly across the dashboard. Connection established. Host network identified. Ethan had plugged in the drive. The decoy algorithm was awake. I watched the incoming data stream with clinical precision. The hidden script was doing its job perfectly. It logged the serial number of Ethan's personal laptop. It captured his exact keystrokes as he navigated through the fake folders. It recorded the timestamps of every single click. The forensic dossier was building itself in real time, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence for the authorities. But as the network telemetry resolved on my screen, I noticed an alarming detail. The tracing software identified the destination IP address where Ethan was attempting to upload the files. He was not sending my algorithms to a corporate recruiter. He was not even sending them to a rival automotive firm in Detroit. The digital pathway was bouncing through a series of encrypted proxy servers, routing deep into an untraceable dark web marketplace. The recipient was masked behind a notorious cipher used exclusively by underground technology brokers. The very same criminal syndicate Valerie had warned me about. The danger level in the room spiked instantly. My husband was not just a common thief. He was actively engaging with organized crime. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my pulse quickening as a new incoming message flashed across the intercepted data stream. The intercepted chat window pulsed with stark white text against a black background. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the frantic exchange between my husband and the anonymous buyer. Ethan was using a standard unencrypted messaging protocol, an amateur mistake that allowed my telemetry beacon to capture every keystroke in real time. The buyer operated under a numerical alias, communicating in short, cryptic sentences. Ethan was typing in paragraphs, his words laced with undeniable panic. He demanded a specific sum for the architectural algorithms. I stared at the dollar amount glowing on my screen. It was not a random negotiation figure. It matched the precise debt total Valerie had shown me hours earlier at the Renaissance Club. Ethan was not pitching my technology to a legitimate corporate recruiter. He was not trying to leverage my portfolio for a high-paying executive position. He was fencing stolen intellectual property on a dark web marketplace. The recipient IP address bounced through multiple hidden proxy servers, a digital labyrinth used exclusively by underground tech brokers and criminal syndicates. The plot twist settled into my bones, chilling me faster than the winter wind outside. My husband had bypassed mere domestic betrayal and dove headfirst into federal criminality. He was bartering my life's work to pacify a dangerous loan shark. Beatrice had always prided herself on her pristine social image, looking down her nose at anyone who lacked a historic family crest. Yet her vanity had driven her into the arms of predatory lenders. When her superficial investments collapsed, she dragged her son into the wreckage. Now Ethan was acting as her desperate accomplice, risking decades in a federal penitentiary just to keep the Yacht Club Society from discovering their true financial ruin. They were no longer just greedy, entitled relatives. They were reckless liabilities, thrashing in deep water, willing to drag me down to save themselves. I needed to formalize the evidence. I unlocked my phone and dialed the private cell number of my corporate estate attorney. Jonathan is a senior partner at a formidable law firm downtown. We met 5 years ago during a vicious patent dispute involving a rival automotive manufacturer. Jonathan possesses a razor-sharp intellect and views litigation as a ruthless chess match. He does not operate on emotion. He operates on leverage statutes and undeniable proof. He is the exact kind of ally required when dealing with cornered, unpredictable enemies. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional despite the late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him the situation at the Grosse Pointe estate had escalated far beyond a simple eviction and divorce proceeding. I explained the telemetry beacon, the intercepted chat logs, and the dark web routing protocol. Jonathan listened in silence, the gears of his brilliant mind processing the raw data. When I mentioned the specific dollar amount and the underground syndicate, I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "You understand what this means, Daria," Jonathan said, his tone dropping an octave. "This is no longer just white-collar embezzlement or spousal theft. Your husband is attempting to traffic stolen proprietary technology across state lines using illicit digital networks. That triggers automatic federal jurisdiction. We are looking at wire fraud, interstate commerce violations, and potential racketeering charges. If the authorities catch wind of this transaction, Ethan will not just lose his house, he will lose his freedom." I kept my eyes fixed on the laptop monitor. The progress bar for Ethan's sample file transfer was creeping towards 70%. The anonymous buyer had demanded a piece of the source code to verify its authenticity. My husband, eager to secure the cash, was willingly handing over the keys to the kingdom. I told Jonathan to stand by. I could not allow the actual decoy file to reach the syndicate. That would alert the criminal network and potentially endanger my genuine research. I typed a manual override command into my terminal, targeting the hidden script inside the silver flash drive. I hit the enter key. The connection severed instantly. The telemetry beacon self-destructed, erasing its own footprint from Ethan's machine while simultaneously corrupting the flash drive's memory core. To my husband, sitting in his home office, it would look like a catastrophic hardware failure. The drive was now a useless, dead brick of metal. He would panic. He would try to restart his computer. He would frantically message the buyer, only to find the connection permanently closed. The transaction was dead, but the forensic trail was immortalized on my hard drive. I exported the finalized dossier. It contained the IP traces the webcam captures of Ethan's face, illuminated by the screen, the chat transcripts, and the forged bank withdrawal slips. I encrypted the entire package and routed it to Jonathan's secure server. A moment later, my lawyer confirmed receipt. "We have the kill shot," Jonathan declared. "The paperwork for the property eviction is already drafted. The divorce settlement is ready for your signature. But this new dossier gives us a nuclear option. I am going to draft a formal incident report for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We will not file it immediately. We will hold it in escrow. It will serve as an invisible leash. When the time comes to dictate the terms of their surrender, you will present Ethan with two choices. He signs away everything, or he goes to prison." I agreed with the strategy. I thanked Jonathan for his swift execution and ended the call. The silence returned to the hotel suite, but it was a triumphant, heavy quiet. I had stripped Ethan of his stolen prize. I had secured the evidence needed to destroy his future. He was currently sitting in the Tudor mansion, staring at a broken flash drive, realizing his one ticket out of debt had just evaporated into thin air. The panic settling into his chest right now would be exquisite. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Night had fully claimed the city. The sky was clear, devoid of clouds, which meant the atmospheric insulation was gone. The temperature outside was plummeting to historic lows. The wind howled against the reinforced glass of my suite, a bitter, freezing gale sweeping off the lake. I crossed my arms, feeling the warm, circulated air of the hotel room keeping me perfectly comfortable. Beatrice thought she could use the harsh Michigan winter as a weapon against me. She thought banishing me to an unheated garage would break my spirit and force my compliance. But she had forgotten a critical detail about the sprawling historic estate she pretended to own. Maintaining a stone mansion requires continuous, substantial utility payments. Payments that Ethan had neglected for months because he was funneling all their liquid cash to a predatory lender. My phone buzzed on the oak desk. A notification flashed on the screen from the smart home security application linked to the Grosse Pointe property. The digital thermostat had registered a systemic failure. The final phase of their punishment was about to begin. The notification glowing on my phone screen was a simple, automated alert from the smart home security application. System offline. Environmental control severed. I tapped the message and mirrored the application to the large television screen mounted on the wall of my hotel suite. When I purchased the Grosse Pointe estate through my blind holding company 2 years ago, I authorized a comprehensive upgrade to the property infrastructure. I ordered the installation of discrete, high-definition audio-visual monitors and thermal sensors in the crown molding of every common room. My intention was to protect my real estate investment from damage. Tonight, those hidden cameras transformed into a front-row seat to a spectacular collapse. The living room of the Tudor mansion materialized in crisp resolution on my screen. The digital overlay displayed the internal climate of the house. The temperature was plunging rapidly. 60 degrees, 55, 50. Historic stone architecture possesses very little natural insulation. Without a roaring furnace to push hot air through the old vents, the freezing Michigan winter penetrates the thick walls with relentless efficiency. Frost was already beginning to form on the inside corners of the leaded glass windows. The grand hearth, which had blazed so brightly just hours ago, was reduced to a miserable pile of gray ash and dying embers. I leaned back against the plush pillows of my king-sized bed, pulling the warm down comforter over my legs. The contrast was deeply satisfying. The hotel suite was set to a perfect 72 degrees. The air was rich with the scent of cedar and room service coffee. Meanwhile, the woman who had condemned me to sleep in an unheated brick garage was currently experiencing that exact same bitter chill in her own parlor. Earlier in the evening, right before Beatrice delivered her cruel ultimatum, she had tightened her cashmere shawl and complained about a severe draft. She had snapped at Ethan, asking if he had finally settled the overdue utility notice. My husband had nodded quickly, assuring his mother the gas company was handled. That was yet another pathetic lie. Ethan had ignored the final warning letters. He had diverted every available cent, including my stolen investment funds, to appease the underground technology broker. He left the mundane household bills to default. The utility provider had just executed a remote shutoff, plunging the proud aristocratic home into a deep freeze. On the television screen, the reality of their situation was taking hold. Beatrice was huddled on the velvet sofa. She was wearing her designer winter coat over her evening clothes, wrapped in 3 separate wool blankets. She looked frail, small, and stripped of her formidable society armor. She was shivering visibly, her breath pluming in the frigid air of the living room. Ethan was pacing the length of the Persian rug. He was wearing his heavy camel hair coat, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He clutched his cellular phone in his right hand, his thumbs flying across the screen in a frantic rhythm. He was trying to reconnect with the anonymous buyer from the dark web marketplace. He did not realize the silver flash drive in his pocket was now a dead, corrupted piece of metal. He thought his network connection was merely dropping. He paced faster, stopping near the window to hold the phone higher, desperate for a signal that would never come. I unmuted the audio feed. The sound of their panic filled my quiet room. Beatrice demanded to know why the radiators were silent. Her voice was a shrill, shivering echo. She commanded Ethan to call the emergency maintenance line and threaten them with legal action. She told him to invoke their family name, insisting that utility companies do not treat legacy residents like common street beggars. Ethan stopped pacing. He turned toward his mother, his eyes wide and hollow. The illusion of his competence shattered in an instant. He stared at the woman who had coddled him his entire life and confessed the truth. He told her there was no mistake. He admitted he had not paid the gas bill in 3 months. Beatrice dropped her blankets. The shock registered on her face, quickly followed by a twisted, venomous fury. She asked him where the money went. She demanded to know how he could allow her to freeze in her own parlor. The pressure broke my husband. The impending threat of the criminal syndicate, the failed corporate espionage, and the biting cold pushed him over the edge. He screamed back at her. The sound clipped the sensitive microphones in the ceiling. He told Beatrice the money went to keep her out of a shallow grave. He confessed that the cash he stole from my accounts was gone. He revealed that he tried to sell my proprietary algorithms to pay off her loan shark, but the drive had crashed. The buyer had vanished. The digital lifeline was severed. Beatrice stared at him in horror. She called him an incompetent fool. She said he was supposed to secure her legacy, but instead, he had ruined everything they built. She berated him for failing to execute a simple transaction. She blamed him for my departure, claiming he should have controlled his wife better. Ethan fired back, his voice cracking under the strain. He reminded his mother that she was the one who borrowed money from a dangerous underworld figure just to pay for a yacht club gala. He called her a vain, obsessed parasite who cared more about country club gossip than her own survival. He pointed a shaking finger at her and declared that he had committed federal wire fraud to clean up her mess. The toxic codependency that had sustained them for decades unraveled in a matter of minutes. They tore each other apart in the freezing dark, shifting the blame, refusing to take an ounce of personal accountability. The internal temperature of the house hit 45 degrees. The pipes in the walls groaned in protest, contracting under the sudden thermal shift. If they did not restore the heat soon, the plumbing would burst, causing thousands of dollars in water damage. But I was not concerned. My insurance policy on the holding company was ironclad. Let the plaster crack. Let the pipes shatter. It was a small price to pay for this immaculate performance. The screaming match exhausted them. Silence fell over the living room, broken only by the sound of their chattering teeth. They sat in the frigid gloom, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a stark, undeniable reality. The loan shark was waiting for a payment they did not possess. The house was a freezer. Their credit was destroyed. They were entirely destitute. Beatrice pulled the wool blankets tight against her chin. Her eyes darted around the dark room before settling on Ethan. The anger in her voice was replaced by a desperate, calculating whisper. She told him they had one option left. She said Daria was sitting in a warm hotel downtown with a severance package from the corporate merger. Ethan shook his head, burying his face in his hands. He muttered that I was broke, that my accounts were frozen, that I had begged him for $500 just this morning. Beatrice dismissed his concerns with a wave of her trembling hand. She insisted I was resourceful. She reasoned that a tech executive would have emergency funds, hidden equity, or wealthy colleagues to borrow from. She claimed I was weak, naive, and eager for their validation. She told Ethan they needed to drive to the city tomorrow morning. They would apologize. They would blame the garage incident on winter stress. They would manipulate me into returning, drain whatever cash I had left, and use my name to secure a new line of credit. I smiled at the television screen, listening to their pathetic scheme take shape. They truly believed I was a gullible pawn waiting to be rescued. They were planning to walk straight into the center of my trap. I reached for the remote control and powered off the display. The screen faded to black, leaving me in the peaceful comfort of my suite. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the room wash over me, ready to face them at dawn. Morning arrived with the quiet hum of the espresso machine on the marble counter of my hotel suite. I poured the dark liquid into a small ceramic cup and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Detroit skyline stretched out below me, catching the first pale rays of winter sunlight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a frozen, glittering city. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. The rich warmth spread through my chest, a stark contrast to the scene I had witnessed on my security monitors just hours before. My husband and his mother had spent the entire night shivering in the dark, trapped inside a freezing, historic mansion they no longer possessed the funds to heat. They had screamed at each other, unraveling under the pressure of their criminal debts. A younger version of myself might have felt a twinge of pity for them. A naive version of myself might have called the utility company and paid the overdue balance just to spare them the physical discomfort. I set the ceramic cup on the desk and looked down at my left hand. I gripped the diamond wedding band and slid it off my finger. The cold metal dropped onto the mahogany wood with a hollow clink. Staring at the ring, the final remnants of my empathy evaporated, replaced by a memory that had haunted me for 4 years. It was the second Saturday in August. The air outside the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club was thick with summer humidity, but inside the grand ballroom, the climate was perfectly chilled. It was my wedding day. I was wearing a heavy silk gown, carrying a bouquet of white orchids. The reception was in full swing. Hundreds of guests milled around the room, sipping vintage champagne and whispering about the new bride who lacked a recognizable family name. I had slipped away from the main floor, seeking a moment of quiet in the private ladies' lounge, to fix a torn lace hem on my dress. The room was secluded, dimly lit, and heavily carpeted. I was kneeling on the floor, adjusting the fabric, when the heavy oak doors swung open. I froze, hidden behind a tall velvet partition, not wanting to engage in forced small talk. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Ethan's mother, accompanied by a prominent society matron named Mrs. Davenport. They walked toward the vanity mirrors, the scent of expensive perfume filling the small space. Mrs. Davenport asked the question I knew every legacy family had been whispering since the engagement was announced. She asked how a proud, historic lineage could accept a girl from the city, a girl who built computers instead of attending the right finishing schools. I expected my new mother-in-law to defend me. I expected her to mention my academic achievements, my prestigious career in quantum architecture, or the simple fact that her son loved me. Instead, a cruel, mocking laugh echoed through the lounge. Ethan's mother told her friend not to worry about the purity of their bloodline. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but every word pierced through the velvet partition like a polished dagger. She explained that I was a temporary charity case. She called me a useful placeholder. She detailed how the family estate required substantial capital to maintain, and my tech industry salary was a convenient solution to their cash flow problems. She said Ethan was young and prone to financial mistakes. She needed someone to foot the bills until he matured and stabilized his professional portfolio. Once he was established, she promised Mrs. Davenport they would discard me. She assured her peer that Ethan would eventually secure a proper legacy bride, a woman with the right pedigree and the correct zip code. I knelt on the floor of that lounge, clutching the silk of my wedding dress, unable to breathe. I listened as they reapplied their lipstick, laughed about my working-class background, and walked back out to the reception to drink the champagne I had paid for. I did not confront her that day. I swallowed the humiliation. I came from a world where merit and hard work were supposed to bridge any divide. I foolishly believed that if I proved my worth, I could earn their respect. For 4 years, I operated under the delusion of a meritocracy. I paid the exorbitant mortgage. I covered the secret credit card debts. I established the blind holding company to save them from a public bankruptcy, pretending I knew nothing so they could keep their fragile pride intact. I played the role of the quiet, obedient provider. I believed my utility would eventually translate into humanity. I thought my financial support would magically transform into genuine familial love. Taking another sip of my espresso in the present, I realized the full extent of my own foolishness. You cannot buy respect from people who measure human value in inheritance and country club gossip. They never saw me as a daughter. They never saw me as a wife. I was a walking bank account. The moment they thought the direct deposits had stopped, the moment they believed I was unemployed and useless, they banished me to a freezing brick garage without a second thought. The memory extinguished every lingering doubt in my mind. The ruthless strategy I had designed was not a cruel overreaction. It was a perfectly calibrated response to 4 years of silent, systemic abuse. They had treated my life like a stepping stone. Now I was going to pull the ground out from under their feet. My mobile phone vibrated against the desk, vibrating right next to my discarded wedding ring. I picked it up and saw an incoming call from Jonathan, my corporate estate attorney. I answered the call, my voice steady and cold. Jonathan skipped the standard morning greetings. He informed me that the county judge had reviewed our emergency filing. The digital deed from my holding company, combined with the evidence of the forged banking withdrawals, provided all the necessary leverage. The eviction notice was officially signed and stamped. The local sheriff was on standby, waiting for my signal to clear the Tudor mansion. I thanked Jonathan for his swift execution. I told him to draft the final divorce parameters, ensuring Ethan surrendered every claim to alimony and asset division. Jonathan confirmed the paperwork was ready. He also mentioned that the formal incident report regarding the dark web technology transfer was sitting in a secure digital escrow, ready to be forwarded to federal authorities the moment my husband tried to fight back. Just as I disconnected the call with my lawyer, a text message illuminated my screen. It was from Valerie. She had been monitoring the main roads leading out of the Grosse Pointe suburbs. Her message was brief, but electrifying. She reported that my husband's luxury sedan had just passed her position on Interstate 94, heading directly toward the downtown hotel district. They were coming. The freezing night had broken their resolve just as I predicted. The failed dark web sale and the looming threat of the loan shark had forced their hand. They were driving to my location right now, rehearsing their lies, preparing to manipulate the vulnerable, unemployed woman they thought they had left behind. I walked over to the closet and retrieved a tailored charcoal business suit. It was a designer piece, sharp, formidable, and entirely unapproachable. It was the armor of a woman who commanded wealth and authority. I dressed meticulously, tying my hair back into a severe knot. I wanted them to look at me and instantly realize the magnitude of their miscalculation. I picked up the room phone and dialed the concierge desk down in the lobby. I provided the names of my husband and his mother. I explicitly instructed the security staff not to block their entry. When they arrived, the staff was to direct them straight to the top floor executive suite. I wanted them to walk out of the freezing cold and step directly into the overwhelming warmth of the luxury I controlled. The stage was perfectly set. The final confrontation was hurtling toward my door. The silence of my executive suite was shattered by a piercing digital tone. The tracking software on my laptop illuminated with a flashing crimson indicator. I walked over to the oak desk and stared at the incoming data stream. The kill switch I had triggered the previous night was only a localized dormant state. It simulated a catastrophic hardware failure to prevent the initial transfer, but the core script remained active, waiting for a new host machine. Ethan was simply too desperate to accept defeat. He had brought the silver flash drive with him to the hotel. While his mother waited near the elevators, he had slipped into the lobby business center to make one final panicked attempt to extract the quantum algorithms. The malware bypassed the basic security protocols of the public terminal and silently activated the integrated camera. A high-resolution image populated on my screen. I looked at the time-stamped photograph of my husband. The physical toll of the freezing night was undeniable. His eyes were sunken, framed by dark, bruised circles. His hair, usually styled with pristine care, hung in greasy strands across his forehead. His expensive camel hair coat was wrinkled and damp from the melting snow. He looked like a cornered animal, staring at the glowing monitor, silently praying the encrypted files would magically unlock so he could pay off his criminal debts. The progress bar for the network trace filled the screen. The script was logging the exact recipient of the illegal transfer. Ethan was trying to reconnect with the underground technology broker. This specific broker was not a random dark web user. My prior research indicated the alias belonged to a fencing operation tied to an interstate racketeering syndicate. The moment Ethan attempted to transmit my intellectual property across state lines to a known criminal enterprise, he crossed a very dangerous line. The green progress bar reached 100%. The data lock finalized. The trap was permanently sprung. I compiled the webcam photograph, the public terminal routing numbers, and the dark web communication logs into a single encrypted folder. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer. Before becoming a senior partner in corporate estate law, Jonathan spent 10 years as a federal prosecutor in the cybercrime division. He built his career dismantling corporate espionage rings and prosecuting white-collar criminals who thought they could outsmart the digital footprint. He left the government sector for private practice years ago, but he retained all his high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He knew exactly how to package raw telemetry data into an ironclad indictment. Jonathan answered immediately. I told him the final piece of evidence had just arrived. I explained the business center terminal breach and the time-stamped photograph of my husband executing the transfer. Jonathan let out a low breath of appreciation. He told me Ethan had handed us the perfect weapon. The previous evidence was strong, but this new logged attempt from a public computer demonstrated premeditated, sustained intent to commit wire fraud. It erased any potential defense of an accidental click or a misunderstood download. It was undeniable corporate espionage. I instructed Jonathan to prepare the formal law enforcement report. I told him to place it in the secure digital escrow we discussed. The federal machinery was now fully operational. The indictment was drafted, verified, and waiting for my final command to send it to the authorities. Next, I asked about the eviction execution. Jonathan confirmed the county judge had signed the final order earlier this morning. The local sheriff was holding the paperwork, ready to clear the Tudor mansion the moment I gave the green light. The divorce settlement was also finalized, printed on heavy stock paper and resting in Jonathan's briefcase. Every legal avenue for my husband and his mother was systematically blocked. I ended the call and closed my laptop. I slipped the computer into my leather bag. The digital warfare was over. The physical confrontation was about to begin. The telephone on the wall chimed softly. It was the front desk concierge. She informed me that my guests had arrived and were heading up to the top floor in the private elevator. I thanked her and hung up the receiver. I walked toward the entryway of the suite. I paused by the hallway mirror to check my reflection. The tailored charcoal business suit fit perfectly. My hair was pulled back into a severe professional knot. I did not look like a grieving wife. I looked like a chief executive officer preparing to terminate a toxic liability. A hesitant knock echoed from the heavy wooden door. I reached out and turned the brass deadbolt. I pulled the door open. Ethan and Beatrice stood in the carpeted hallway. The visual contrast between us was striking. I was standing in a perfectly climate-controlled luxury suite, radiating warmth and authority. They looked like refugees fleeing a winter disaster. Beatrice was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, layered under a heavy designer winter coat. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with a faint shade of blue from hours of exposure to the freezing temperatures of the mansion. The aristocratic arrogance she usually wore like a crown was entirely absent. She looked small, fragile, and terrified. Ethan stood beside her, shivering involuntarily. The webcam photograph had not captured the full extent of his exhaustion. He clutched his hands together, his knuckles white. He tried to muster a confident smile, but his facial muscles betrayed him, twitching with nervous energy. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. They stared at the plush interior of my suite, the warm lighting, and the pristine conditions I was enjoying. They expected to find me sitting in a cheap motel crying over my empty bank accounts. Instead, they found me standing at the pinnacle of comfort. Beatrice broke the silence. She took a step forward, crossing the threshold into my domain. She reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to touch my arm. I stepped back, denying her the physical contact. Her eyes filled with manufactured tears. The performance began. She forced a wavering maternal tone into her voice. She told me the garage incident was a terrible misunderstanding. She claimed the stress of the winter season and the sudden news of my career shift had caused her to speak without thinking. She begged me to forgive her temporary lapse in judgment. Ethan nodded vigorously, stepping into the room behind his mother. He told me they had been worried sick about me. He claimed the house felt empty without me. He promised we could go to marriage counseling, fix our communication issues, and rebuild our life together. Then, the true motive slipped through his facade. He asked if my corporate merger had provided a severance package, suggesting we could use those funds to turn the heat back on and save our historic family home. I looked at the two people who had spent 4 years draining my wealth, insulting my background, and plotting to discard me. They were standing in my hotel room, spinning a web of pathetic lies, desperately trying to manipulate their way out of a freezing house and a criminal debt. They finished their rehearsed apologies and waited for my response. They expected me to crumble, to weep with relief, and to hand over my checkbook. I let the silence stretch, savoring the palpable tension in the air. I looked at my husband, then I looked at his mother. Then I prepared to deliver the first devastating blow. I looked at the two people who had spent 4 years draining my wealth. They were standing in my hotel room, spinning a web of pathetic lies. I let the silence stretch. I looked at my husband, then I looked at his mother. Then I prepared to deliver the first devastating blow. I told Beatrice she looked terrible. I kept my voice perfectly flat. I pointed out her damp coat and her shivering hands. I reminded her that it was Friday. Friday meant her standing winter luncheon at the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club. The society wives would be waiting for her. If she missed it, they would whisper. They would assume the rumors about her financial ruin were true. Beatrice stiffened. Her vanity was a powerful reflex. She smoothed her wrinkled lapel and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. I told her to leave. I said Ethan and I needed to discuss our marriage and my corporate severance package in private. I suggested she go to the club, use the locker room facilities to warm up and host her lunch. I promised we would join her later with a solution to the utility bills. Beatrice swallowed the bait without a single hesitation. The prospect of fresh capital blinded her to the trap. She thought I was about to hand her son a blank check. She gave Ethan a knowing, triumphant glance, silently instructing him to secure the funds. Then she turned and walked out the door, eager to return to her throne. She had no idea her kingdom was already ashes. Once the door clicked shut, I instructed Ethan to sit at the desk. I poured him a glass of water. I needed him isolated. I needed him waiting while the first phase of my retaliation detonated miles away. I picked up my phone and dialed Valerie. Valerie was already seated at a corner table inside the grand dining room of the yacht club. She answered the call and placed her phone face up on the white tablecloth, leaving the line open. The acoustic design of the dining hall carried every sound directly into my earpiece. While my husband sat nervously across from me in the hotel suite, I listened to the live broadcast of his mother facing her destruction. Valerie narrated the scene in a low, quiet murmur. Beatrice strode into the dining room. She had freshened her makeup and brushed her hair, wearing a borrowed confidence fueled by my empty promises. She greeted the legacy wives at her central table. She waved to the waitstaff, ordering 2 bottles of vintage champagne and a spread of expensive seafood. She was celebrating. She told her peers that her son and his wife were finalizing a highly lucrative corporate transition. She spun a beautiful fairy tale about our family wealth. The luncheon proceeded for an hour. The society wives drank the champagne, laughing at Beatrice's practice jokes, entirely unaware of the predatory loan shark breathing down her neck. Then the dessert plates were cleared. The waiter approached the table, carrying a leather folio. Valerie described the waiter leaning down, whispering something discreet to my mother-in-law. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, producing her premium credit card. She placed it on the silver tray with a theatrical flourish. The waiter walked away. 3 minutes later, the waiter returned. He was not alone. Through the phone speaker, I heard the heavy, measured footsteps of Mr. Sterling. He was the chief financial treasurer of the yacht club. He was a strict, unforgiving man who despised unpaid accounts. He marched directly to the center of the dining room. The ambient chatter of the surrounding tables died down, replaced by a tense, eager silence. Mr. Sterling did not whisper. He projected his voice for the entire room to hear. He informed Beatrice that her card had been declined. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, artificial laugh. She tried to brush it off as a banking error. She told Mr. Sterling to run the card again, claiming her credit limit was boundless. Mr. Sterling shook his head. He announced that every card on her account was frozen. Then he delivered the fatal strike. He stated that her membership account was currently $45,000 in arrears. He demanded immediate payment for the delinquent seasonal dues, the unpaid dining tabs, and the outstanding mooring fees. The gasp from the society wives echoed through my earpiece. The women who had just shared her champagne were now staring at her in sheer horror. In Grosse Pointe, poverty was the ultimate sin. Being exposed as a fraud in the middle of the dining room was a social death sentence. Beatrice panicked. Her voice cracked as she tried to salvage her pride. She told the treasurer there was a mistake. She invoked my name. She announced that Daria Henry was the financial guarantor on the account. She insisted her daughter-in-law would wire the funds before the end of the business day. I smiled, listening from my hotel room. Valerie spoke up next. Her voice was smooth and commanding, carrying across the silent dining hall. Valerie walked over to Beatrice's table. She told her estranged mother-in-law that Daria Henry had formally withdrawn her financial guarantee at 9 o'clock this morning. Beatrice turned around, staring at Valerie in shock. She demanded to know why Valerie was even allowed inside the building. Beatrice screamed that Valerie was not a member. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, shifting the attention back to himself. He corrected Beatrice. He announced that the board of directors had reviewed the delinquent account. To recover the $45,000 in missing funds, the board had authorized the immediate sale of Beatrice's legacy membership spot. He gestured toward Valerie. He informed the room that the arrears had been paid in full by an anonymous holding company just an hour ago. The highly coveted legacy membership had been permanently transferred. Valerie was now the sole owner of the title. The silence that followed was heavy and final. Beatrice realized she had lost everything. The shield she used to deflect criticism, the crown she wore to intimidate outsiders, it was all gone. It now belonged to the very woman she had spent years marginalizing and insulting. Beatrice tried to argue. She slammed her hands on the table, demanding to speak to the board president. She shrieked that her family name built the foundations of this club. She claimed they could not simply erase her history. Mr. Sterling did not entertain her delusion. He signaled the security staff standing near the entrance. 2 men in dark suits approached the table. Mr. Sterling politely requested that Beatrice vacate the premises immediately. He informed her that she was no longer permitted on the private grounds, and any future attempts to enter would be treated as criminal trespassing. Valerie whispered into the phone, telling me that Beatrice looked like a ghost. The color had drained from her face. The society wives at her table had already turned their backs, pretending she did not exist. They were distancing themselves from the infection of her ruin. Beatrice gathered her coat with trembling hands. She did not say another word. She walked across the dining room, escorted by the security guards, her head bowed in profound humiliation. The legacy wives watched her leave, their eyes cold and judgmental. The phantom aristocratic empire she had spent her life protecting dissolved into nothing. Valerie picked up the phone. She told me the operation was a flawless success. She thanked me for the membership and promised to enjoy a second bottle of champagne in my honor. We ended the call. I set my phone face down on the desk. The first target was neutralized. Beatrice was wandering the frozen streets, stripped of her identity, exiled from her sanctuary. She had nothing left to lose, which made her dangerous. But she was no longer my primary concern. I turned my chair around to face the center of the hotel suite. Ethan was still sitting on the edge of the sofa. He was holding the glass of water, his knuckles white, his eyes darting around the room nervously. He was waiting for me to discuss my severance package. He was waiting for the financial lifeline he desperately needed to pay off his loan shark and avoid a federal prison sentence. He had no idea his mother was currently standing in the snow, ruined and discarded. He had no idea the flash drive in his pocket was a digital snare. He thought he was minutes away from salvation. I looked at my husband. I folded my hands in my lap and prepared to shatter his reality. The game was reaching its final stage, and the consequences were about to trap him in a cage of his own making. I watched my husband sit on the edge of the sofa inside my hotel suite. His hands were clasped together, his knuckles strained and white. He was waiting for a financial rescue. He believed I was moments away from handing him a blank check from my corporate severance package. I stood up from the mahogany desk and smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I looked down at him, masking my contempt behind a blank, professional expression. I told Ethan we needed to head downstairs. I explained that a vital financial associate was waiting for us in the main atrium to finalize the legal paperwork for my transition funds. Ethan practically leaped from the cushions. A spark of profound greed ignited in his exhausted eyes. He quickly buttoned his damp camel hair coat, eager to secure the cash that would save him from the dark web syndicate. He followed me out of the suite, walking with a renewed, frantic energy. We stepped into the glass elevator. As the cab descended toward the ground floor, I studied his reflection in the mirrored walls. He was practicing his grateful husband routine. He adjusted his collar, wiped the nervous sweat from his forehead, and tried to force a confident smile. He thought he was walking toward his salvation. He had no idea he was descending into a meticulously engineered execution. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. We stepped out into the sprawling expanse of the ground floor. The hotel lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Polished marble floors stretched toward a towering stone fireplace that cast a warm, golden glow across the room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, illuminating the quiet conversations of wealthy travelers. Standing near the concierge desk was Jonathan. My corporate estate attorney wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit, holding a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. Flanking him were two broad-shouldered hotel security directors dressed in discreet, dark uniforms. Jonathan caught my eye and offered a single, curt nod. The perimeter was secured. Before I could introduce Ethan to my lawyer, a sudden commotion erupted near the front entrance. The heavy revolving glass doors spun with frantic speed. A blast of freezing winter wind whipped snow across the threshold. Beatrice stumbled into the warm lobby. The expulsion from the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club had broken her physical posture. She must have taken a taxi from the country club, forced to walk the remaining distance through the slush-filled streets. Her designer winter coat was disheveled and stained with dirty snow. Her hair, usually styled into an immaculate crest, clung to her cheeks in damp, frozen strands. Her makeup was ruined by streaks of frozen tears. She was trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering in a desperate, rhythmic cadence. She looked frantic, scanning the expansive room, until her eyes locked onto me. She spotted Ethan, standing by my side. Survival instinct took over. She rushed forward, ignoring the curious stares of the passing guests. She ignored Jonathan. She ignored the security guards. She stopped 3 feet away from me, blocked by the subtle shift of the security directors stepping into her path. She looked at my pristine business suit, then down at her own ruined clothing. The contrast was undeniable. The woman who had treated me like a disposable charity case was now begging at my feet. Beatrice launched into a practiced theatrical performance. Her voice quivered with manufactured sorrow. She clasped her trembling hands together and pressed them against her chest. She cried out my name, letting a sob catch in her throat. She claimed the ultimatum in the garage was a tragic mistake born of seasonal anxiety. She blamed the bitter cold, the stress of the impending holidays, and the sudden shock of my career shift. She swore she never intended to throw me out into the blizzard. She called me the heart of their family. She pleaded for me to forgive her temporary lapse in judgment. She begged me to release the corporate transition funds so we could return to the historic Tudor mansion, turn the heat back on, and repair our fractured household. It was the same manipulative tactic she had used to control her late husband. She weaponized guilt and tears to bend people to her will. Now she was trying to use those rusty tools on me. Ethan sensed the shifting dynamic. He stepped up beside his mother, adding his own layer of desperate deception. He reached out his hand, hovering in the air between us. He added his own empty promises to the chorus. He vowed to attend intensive marriage counseling. He swore he would protect our relationship from any future interference. He apologized for failing to defend me the previous night, citing his own overwhelming panic. He asked me to trust him one last time, promising that a fresh infusion of capital would solve all their lingering issues. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a mother and son, bound by toxic entitlement and predatory greed. They shivered in the warm glow of the lobby chandeliers, performing a symphony of lies, desperate to reel in their primary asset. I let their pathetic performance echo through the quiet atrium. I did not interrupt. I did not roll my eyes. I simply let the silence stretch, forcing them to hear the hollow ring of their own voices. I studied the two people who had stolen my wealth, forged my signature, and attempted to sell my life's work to an underground criminal syndicate. They finally ran out of breath. The manufactured tears slowed. They waited, staring at me with wide, expectant eyes, anticipating my capitulation. I looked at them with unyielding, chilling stillness. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that cut through the lingering tension. Too late. The two words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. Beatrice froze. The fake sorrow vanished from her face, replaced by genuine, paralyzing confusion. Ethan blinked rapidly, his forced smile collapsing into a grimace of pure dread. They did not understand the finality of my statement. They still believed they held a shred of negotiating power. I turned my gaze toward the man in the pinstripe suit standing to my left. "Ethan," I said, gesturing toward him, "I told you we were coming downstairs to meet a vital financial associate. You assumed he was here to hand you a corporate severance check. That was a miscalculation on your part." I gestured to the leather briefcase. "I would like to introduce you to Jonathan. He is not a transition coordinator. He is a senior partner specializing in corporate estate law. Prior to his private practice, he served for a decade as a federal prosecutor in the cybercrime division." Ethan took a staggering step backward. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Jonathan, then down at the thick leather briefcase. The terrifying reality of his situation began to dawn on him. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her trembling hands dropping to her sides. I looked back at my husband. The final sequence of total destruction was now in motion. I told him we were not here to reconcile. We were here to dictate the terms of his surrender. Jonathan clicked the brass locks on his briefcase. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet lobby. The unmasking had officially begun, and there was no escape from the evidence waiting inside. Jonathan popped the brass latches on his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic sound echoed in the quiet space between us. He reached inside and extracted a single sheet of heavy stock paper. He handed it to me. I held the document in my right hand, letting my eyes sweep over the embossed corporate letterhead. I looked at my mother-in-law. She was staring at the paper, her eyes wide with desperate anticipation. She still believed I was holding a severance check. She thought her financial salvation was printed on that page. I decided to shatter that delusion first. I told her the emergency corporate merger did not eliminate my position. I explained that when two global technology firms combine resources to acquire a specialized quantum computing division, they do not fire the chief architect. They promote her. I informed them that my department was paused solely to restructure the executive hierarchy. I read the formal title printed on the letterhead. I was now the Chief Director of Automotive Quantum Technologies. I watched the words register in their minds. I told them my compensation package had tripled. I secured a multi-million-dollar signing bonus and a generous allocation of corporate stock. I did not lose my job. I gained an empire. I possessed more liquid capital in my private accounts right now than their historic family lineage had seen in 3 generations. The remaining color drained from my husband's face. His mother swayed on her feet, clutching the lapels of her damp winter coat. The foundation of their cruel ultimatum was built on the assumption that I was broke and powerless. Now they realized they had thrown a titan out into the snow. But I was not finished. The revelation of my wealth was merely the opening move. I handed the corporate letter back to Jonathan. He slipped it into his briefcase and retrieved a much thicker file folder. He extended his arm and pressed the heavy dossier against Ethan's chest. My husband reflexively grabbed the file in his hands, shaking. He looked down at the bold black letters printed across the front cover. It was a formal incident report addressed to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told Ethan to open it. I instructed him to read the first page. He flipped the heavy cover open. His eyes darted across the text. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. I narrated the contents for the benefit of his mother, ensuring she understood the exact magnitude of his failure. I detailed the forged banking withdrawals. I explained how Ethan had faked my signature to liquidate our joint high-yield investment portfolio. I listed the specific transactions he executed using the stolen funds. He paid the premium credit card balances. He secured the winter gala tickets. His mother gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. She had assumed Ethan used his own savings to cover her debts. She did not know he had robbed his own wife to maintain her fake aristocratic facade. But the embezzlement was only a minor offense compared to what came next. I told Ethan to turn to the third page. I described the underground technology broker operating on the dark web. I mentioned the exact dollar amount of the predatory loan his mother had taken to fund her failed real estate venture. I watched Ethan realize that I knew every single detail of their criminal debt. I explained the silver flash drive. I told him the proprietary quantum algorithms he thought he was stealing were nothing but a digital decoy. I revealed the telemetry beacon hidden inside the code. I told him the software had mapped his host network, captured his keystrokes, and recorded the illicit transaction. I pointed to the photographs clipped to the back of the dossier. I told him those images were taken from the webcam of the public business terminal right here in the hotel lobby. I had a time-stamped visual record of him attempting to transmit classified intellectual property to an interstate criminal syndicate. I laid out the federal charges: wire fraud, corporate espionage, interstate trafficking of stolen digital assets. I informed him that the mandatory minimum sentencing for those crimes would ensure he spent the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. The thick file slipped from Ethan's grasp. It hit the marble floor, the glossy pages fanning out across the polished stone. He did not try to pick it up. He backed away from the documents as if they were covered in poison. The pressure crushed his fragile spine. He was a man who had coasted through life on unearned privilege, shielded from consequences by his family name. Faced with the terrifying reality of a concrete cell and a federal uniform, his cowardly nature took supreme command. He turned toward his mother. He did not look at her with familial love or protective loyalty. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a shaking finger at her face. He raised his voice, the sound echoing through the grand hotel atrium. He screamed that this was her fault. He told everyone listening that she was the one who borrowed money from a dangerous underworld figure. He said her pathetic obsession with country club status had dragged him into a criminal conspiracy. He yelled that she forced him to steal the investment funds. He claimed she pressured him into taking the silver flash drive. He threw her under the bus without a single moment of hesitation, desperate to deflect the federal crosshairs away from his own chest. He begged Jonathan to write down his statement, offering to testify against his own mother if it meant saving himself from prison. His mother stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and revulsion. The maternal bond they had weaponized against me for 4 years evaporated in an instant. She realized her golden child was willing to trade her freedom for his own. She struck back with equal venom. Her voice rose to a shrill, piercing shriek. She called him a pathetic, useless disappointment. She reminded him that he was the one who failed to pay the utility bills, leaving them to freeze in the dark. She said he was a failure who could not even execute a simple digital transaction without getting caught. She disowned him right there in the middle of the lobby. She yelled that he had ruined the historic family legacy. She claimed he was weak, incompetent, and entirely responsible for their destruction. She demanded that Jonathan arrest Ethan and leave her out of the legal proceedings, insisting she had no knowledge of the corporate espionage. They stood 3 feet apart, tearing each other to pieces. The hotel guests stopped their conversations to watch the spectacle. The security directors stood silently, ensuring the chaos remained contained. The toxic alliance that had banished me to a frozen garage was imploding in a spectacular display of mutual betrayal. They were fighting like cornered rats, exposing their deepest resentments and their darkest secrets to anyone willing to listen. I watched them destroy each other. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel the need to raise my voice or join the fray. The dramatic irony was exquisite. They had spent years trying to break my spirit, treating me like a disposable asset. Now, I was standing in a bespoke business suit, watching them incinerate their own lives. I let them scream until their throats were raw. I let them exhaust their pathetic accusations. When they finally ran out of breath, they turned back to face me, chests heaving, eyes filled with terror. They waited for my verdict, hoping their mutual destruction had earned them a fraction of my mercy. I looked at Jonathan and nodded my head. The federal snare had broken their minds. It was time to strip them of their final physical sanctuary. Jonathan reached into his leather briefcase one last time, pulling out the documents that would legally banish them into the freezing Michigan winter forever. The lobby of the luxury hotel fell perfectly silent. Jonathan stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my mother-in-law. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a crisp, heavy document bearing the official seal of the county court. He extended his arm, holding the paperwork steady. Beatrice stared at the pages, her chest still heaving from the screaming match she had just concluded with her son. She snatched the document from his hand, her eyes scanning the bold, legal print. It was a formal order to vacate the premises, signed by a sitting judge just hours ago. Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It was a sound born of sheer delusion. She looked at me, shaking her head, trying to project a confidence she no longer possessed. She declared that I was losing my mind. She announced that the historic Tudor mansion belonged to her family lineage. She claimed her late husband had secured that estate decades ago, and her legacy was carved into the very foundation of the property. She told me a judge could not throw a society resident out of her own ancestral home, regardless of any unpaid utility bills or marital disputes. She dropped the eviction notice onto the marble floor, crossing her arms in defiance, waiting for me to back down. I did not flinch. I nodded to Jonathan. He retrieved a second folder from his briefcase. He opened it and produced a notarized property deed, placing it gently into Beatrice's trembling hand. I explained the reality of her situation, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the quiet atrium. I reminded her of the financial crisis she faced 2 years ago when the bank was preparing a public foreclosure on the estate due to her hidden debts. I detailed how she had begged for my help to maintain her country club illusion. I told her I did not simply pay off her mortgage. I established a blind holding company. I purchased the property outright. I pointed to the signature on the deed. I told her she had sold the historic family home to my corporate entity to avoid bankruptcy. She had lied to her son, claiming she merely refinanced the debt through a private broker. I watched her eyes trace the legal text. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She did not own the walls she slept inside. She did not own the grand stone hearth or the Persian rugs. She was nothing but a delinquent tenant living on my charity. I was her landlord, and her lease was permanently terminated. Ethan stared at his mother in unvarnished horror. He realized his entire inheritance, the physical symbol of his unearned pride, was a fabrication. He had committed wire fraud to protect an estate that belonged entirely to the woman he was robbing. He had risked decades in a federal penitentiary to save a house his mother had sold 2 years prior. The psychological collapse was total. He backed away from her, realizing her lies had orchestrated his ultimate downfall. I looked at my watch. I told them they had exactly 2 hours to return to Grosse Pointe and collect their personal belongings. I clarified that they were only permitted to take clothing and basic necessities. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every silver spoon belonged to the estate. If they attempted to take anything of value, Jonathan would press immediate theft charges. I informed them the local sheriff was already waiting at the property to supervise their departure. I turned away, signaling to the security directors that the conversation was over. We walked toward the private exit, leaving my husband and his mother standing in the lobby, surrounded by the shattered fragments of their fake aristocratic lives. The drive from the downtown hotel to the Grosse Pointe suburbs was a study in contrasts. I rode in the heated leather backseat of a private hired car, watching the frozen city roll past the tinted windows. Jonathan followed close behind in his own vehicle. We were heading toward the final execution of the legal strategy. Meanwhile, Ethan and Beatrice were forced to navigate the treacherous, ice-covered roads in a desperate panic, racing against the 2-hour deadline. They were driving back to a house that was no longer a sanctuary, but a frozen tomb waiting to expel them. 2 hours later, I stood in the grand foyer of the Tudor mansion. The temperature inside the house had dropped even further since the previous night, transforming the sprawling corridors into an icebox. The breath of the local sheriff and his 2 deputies plumed in the freezing air as they stood watch by the front door. The plumbing groaned within the walls, the cold biting through the historic stone. Upstairs, the sound of frantic packing echoed through the cold hallways. Ethan and Beatrice were shoving their designer clothes into cheap plastic trash bags, unable to locate their expensive luggage in the dark. The power was still severed. The ambient light from the gray winter sky cast long, depressing shadows across the hardwood floors. The illusion of old money wealth was stripped away, leaving only the grim reality of an eviction. I stood near the dead fireplace wearing my tailored charcoal suit and a thick cashmere winter coat. I watched my husband drag 2 bulging garbage bags down the grand staircase. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed firmly on his snow boots. He did not look at me. The threat of the federal cybercrime dossier hung over his head, rendering him entirely docile. He walked past the sheriff, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the howling Michigan blizzard. He loaded his bags into the trunk of his sedan, the wind whipping snow across his face. Beatrice descended the stairs a few moments later. She was clutching a small velvet box containing her personal jewelry. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably from the biting cold. The sheriff stepped into her path, politely requesting to inspect the velvet box to ensure she was not stealing any estate assets. The indignity of the search broke her. She had spent her entire life demanding preferential treatment, viewing law enforcement as a service for the wealthy. Now she was being searched like a common criminal in her own hallway. She handed the box to the deputy, her jaw trembling. The officer verified the contents and returned it to her. She walked toward the exit, every step heavy with the weight of her permanent exile. The blizzard outside was merciless. The wind howled off Lake St. Clair, driving sharp needles of ice through the air. The snow was already a foot deep on the driveway, burying the manicured lawns under a frozen white blanket. Ethan was sitting in the driver's seat of his car, the engine running, desperate to escape the nightmare. Beatrice stepped over the threshold, her designer shoes sinking deep into the accumulating snowdrift. The freezing gale struck her immediately. She gasped, wrapping her arms around her chest, her thin coat offering zero protection against the brutal elements. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She turned around to face me. I was standing in the doorway, shielded from the storm, flanked by the authorities. The aristocratic pride she had clung to for decades finally snapped. She dropped to her knees in the snow. The freezing wet slush soaked through her expensive trousers. She looked up at me, the tears freezing on her cheeks. She clasped her hands together in a genuine gesture of pure desperation. She begged for a second chance. She pleaded for a week, just a few days to find a warm place to stay. She offered to work for me, to clean the house, to do anything I asked. She promised to change her behavior. She swore she would never insult my background again. She laid her pride in the dirt, sobbing into the bitter wind, asking for a shred of the mercy she had never shown me. I looked down at the woman who had tormented me for 4 years. I looked at the dark, detached brick garage standing just 20 yards away, the same garage where she had ordered me to sleep just a few nights ago. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm, ensuring every syllable carried through the howling wind. I looked into her terrified eyes and repeated the exact ultimatum. If you cannot contribute, you do not deserve a place here. I stepped back into the foyer. The sheriff closed the heavy oak door, the deadbolt sliding into place with a loud, final click. The storm was shut out, and the poetic justice was served. 7 days later, the chaotic winter weather gave way to a bright, piercing Wednesday morning. I sat inside a sleek, glass-enclosed mediation room on the 40th floor of a prominent downtown legal firm. The expansive window offered an unobstructed view of Lake St. Clair. The frozen water stretched toward the horizon, a flat expanse of jagged ice and deep blue shadows. It was a fitting backdrop for the cold, calculated procedure taking place at the long mahogany conference table. Ethan sat across from me. A single week of exile had aged him a decade. His expensive camel hair coat was gone, replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He kept checking his cellular phone, flinching every time the screen illuminated. The underground technology broker was undoubtedly hunting for the missing payment. The criminal syndicate did not care about our marital disputes. They only cared about collecting their compounding interest. The dark circles under my husband's eyes proved he had not slept since the sheriff escorted him off the Grosse Pointe estate. Jonathan sat beside me, acting as the quiet executioner of my legal strategy. He slid a thick stack of documents across the polished wood. The divorce settlement was a masterpiece of total financial annihilation. I did not ask for a fair division of assets. I demanded unconditional surrender. Ethan stared at the bold print. His hands shook as he read the clauses. The terms were brutal and unyielding. He was relinquishing every claim to the historic Tudor mansion. He was waiving his right to any future alimony or spousal support. Most importantly, he was signing away all potential rights, royalties, and ownership percentages tied to my quantum computing architecture patents. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. He asked if there was any room for compromise. He whispered that his mother was struggling, that they had nowhere to go, that the loan shark was sending threatening messages to his personal email address. He wanted a fraction of my corporate severance package. He begged for just enough capital to buy his way out of the criminal debt he had foolishly inherited. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany table. I reminded him about the digital escrow file. I told him the formal law enforcement incident report was sitting on a secure server addressed to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I explained the mechanics of my legal safeguard. If he attempted to contest the divorce, if he asked for a single penny, or if he ever contacted me again, Jonathan would execute a final command. The telemetry logs, the webcam photographs, and the dark web chat transcripts would instantly transmit to the federal authorities. I laid out his choices with chilling clarity. He could walk away penniless but free, or he could spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and interstate wire fraud. Ethan swallowed hard. The remaining fight drained from his posture. He picked up the heavy fountain pen provided by the mediator. He did not bother reading the rest of the pages. He just signed his name on every dotted line, his signature frantic and uneven. The psychological break was profound. The legal severance was swift and definitive. The marriage that had functioned as a parasitic drain on my life was officially terminated. Jonathan gathered the paperwork, stamped the official seals, and placed them into his leather briefcase. Ethan stood up, avoiding my gaze, and shuffled out of the conference room like a ghost. He was no longer my problem. He belonged to the harsh consequences of his own reckless greed. An hour later, I walked into a high-end bistro located just 2 blocks from the legal firm. The restaurant catered to the elite executives and social innovators of the city. I secured a private booth in the back, ordering a glass of sparkling water and a plate of fresh oysters. I was celebrating my newfound freedom. 5 minutes after I arrived, Valerie walked through the front doors. Valerie looked radiant. She was wearing a tailored white winter coat and carrying a highly exclusive designer handbag. Her posture radiated supreme confidence. By purchasing the Legacy membership and transferring the title into her name, I had essentially crowned her the new queen of the yacht club hierarchy. The society wives, always eager to align themselves with verified wealth and power, had immediately flocked to her side. They abandoned their previous prejudices the moment Valerie presented the ultimate financial credentials. She slid into the booth across from me, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She ordered a glass of vintage champagne to toast our flawless victory. I asked her for a status report on my former mother-in-law. Valerie leaned in, eager to share the final chapter of the social ruin we had orchestrated together. Beatrice was permanently exiled. Valerie informed me that the country club board of directors had circulated a discreet memo to all security personnel flagging her name and photograph. Beatrice was barred from entering the private grounds. Her former friends deleted her phone number from their contacts. When poverty strikes a legacy family, the surrounding aristocrats treat the financial failure like a highly contagious disease. They sever all ties to preserve their own pristine illusions. Mallory detailed a pathetic incident from the previous afternoon. Beatrice had attempted to attend a public charity luncheon hosted at a botanical garden, hoping to corner her old friends and beg for a temporary loan. The hostesses turned her away at the door. Her social erasure was thorough and unforgiving. Then Valerie delivered the most satisfying piece of intelligence. She told me where Beatrice and Ethan were currently living. They had pooled their remaining pocket change to rent a room at a budget motel out on the highway far beyond the city limits. It was a bleak, decaying establishment situated next to a noisy truck stop. There was no room service. There were no grand stone fireplaces. Beatrice was spending her days sitting on a stained mattress, watching standard-definition television and listening to the rumble of 18-wheelers rattling her thin windows. The woman who had demanded I sleep in an unheated brick garage was now trapped in a squalid roadside box, terrified that a loan shark might knock on her flimsy door at any moment. The irony was immaculate. Beatrice had spent her entire existence judging others based on their zip code and their bank accounts. Now she possessed neither. She was invisible. The predatory syndicate hunting her son would soon realize there was no wealth left to extract. The criminals would likely seize Ethan's vehicle and whatever meager possessions they had left, leaving them to wander the frozen outskirts of the city. Valerie raised her champagne flute. We clinked our glasses together, the crystal ringing with a clear, victorious note. The minor conflicts were resolved. The financial parasites were legally severed and geographically removed. My algorithms were safe in a guarded cloud vault. My banking portfolios were secure. I had debugged my life with the same ruthless efficiency I applied to quantum architecture. We finished our lunch in high spirits, discussing Valerie's upcoming philanthropic initiatives and my new role as chief director. When the bill arrived, I paid it with my premium corporate card, savoring the simple pleasure of spending my own money on my own terms. I said goodbye to Valerie on the snowy sidewalk, watching her step into a waiting luxury town car. My private driver pulled up a moment later. I climbed into the heated back seat and gave him the address for the Grosse Pointe estate. The legal battles were won. The enemies were vanquished. It was time to return to the historic Tudor mansion and reclaim the physical space that was always rightfully mine. The final transformation was waiting for me. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Grosse Pointe estate parted smoothly, granting my hired car access to the long, curving driveway. The vehicle tires crunched over fresh snow, coming to a halt in front of the historic Tudor facade. I stepped out into the crisp winter air and thanked the driver. I stood alone on the front walkway, studying the imposing stone structure. For 4 years, this property felt like a museum dedicated to someone else's vanity. It was a monument to unearned arrogance and borrowed prestige. Today, the toxic residue was gone. The air felt lighter. I pulled the heavy brass key from my coat pocket, unlocked the front door, and walked inside. The silence greeting me was profound. There were no shrill complaints about impending country club dues echoing from the parlor. There were no whispered criticisms regarding my working-class background. The space belonged entirely to me, yet the interior design still reeked of my former mother-in-law and her suffocating pretension. Beatrice had favored heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the natural daylight, oppressive dark floral wallpaper, and gaudy gold fixtures meant to mimic European royalty. The environment was stale, trapped in a desperate illusion of old money grandiosity. I did not want to live inside her ghost story. I pulled out my phone and contacted a premier architectural renovation firm based in downtown Detroit. I arranged an immediate consultation. When the lead designer arrived 2 hours later, I handed him a very generous retainer and a strict set of instructions. I wanted the fake aristocratic facade torn down to the studs. Within days, a highly coordinated crew descended upon the property. I watched with quiet satisfaction as workers carried out the remnants of Beatrice's era, tossing the dusty velvet draperies and imitation antique furniture into steel refuse containers positioned in the driveway. The demolition erased the oppressive gloom. We stripped the dark wallpaper to expose the beautiful original stone beneath. We replaced the heavy carpets with rich, wide plank hardwood floors. We installed expansive panes of thermal glass, flooding the historic corridors with brilliant winter light. The house finally learned how to breathe, transformed from a decaying museum into a sanctuary of modern, elegant warmth. Once the interior renovations were underway, I turned my attention to the most symbolic structure on the property. I walked out the side door, tracing the exact path I had taken on that bitter sub-zero night. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I crossed the lawn toward the detached brick garage. I unlatched the heavy wooden doors and pulled them open. The interior was freezing, smelling of engine oil, old cardboard, and dust. This was the dark, unheated box where Beatrice demanded I sleep. This was the place meant to break my spirit and force my total submission. Standing in the center of the cold concrete floor, I felt a deep surge of inspiration. I refused to let this space remain a monument to her cruelty. I decided to repurpose the site of my intended punishment into the beating heart of my new enterprise. I hired a specialized team of industrial contractors. They sealed the exposed brickwork with heavy-duty climate-controlling insulation. They reinforced the roof, upgraded the security perimeter, and trenched high-capacity electrical lines directly from the city grid into the structure. Over the next month, the dusty garage underwent a breathtaking evolution. We installed sleek, towering server racks along the reinforced walls. We fitted the room with advanced liquid cooling systems and redundant fiber optic network connections. The space was secured behind a biometric steel door, requiring my unique thermal signature to open. The freezing, desolate garage became a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled data center for my independent quantum research. My proprietary algorithms pulsed through the glowing processors, the quiet hum of the servers filling the room with a sense of endless potential. The very location designed to isolate and humiliate me was now generating the technology that would secure my future. The winter months gradually yielded to the early thaws of spring, though patches of stubborn ice still clung to the shores of Lake St. Clair. My corporate division officially launched the new architectural framework I had designed. The release sent shockwaves through the automotive and tech sectors. Industry publications hailed the logic gates as a revolutionary breakthrough. My equity shares multiplied, solidifying my position as an untouchable force in the Detroit innovation sphere. One evening, I was sitting by the newly restored grand hearth in the living room. The fire was blazing brightly, casting a warm golden hue over the sleek modern furniture. My mobile phone vibrated on the glass coffee table. The screen displayed an incoming text message from an unlisted prepaid cellular number. I opened the message. It was Ethan. The text was a rambling, pathetic paragraph filled with spelling errors and desperate pleas. He revealed that he was currently working the overnight loading shift at a distribution warehouse just to afford daily meals. The underground technology broker had seized his vehicle to cover a fraction of the outstanding loan interest. He and his mother were facing eviction from their squalid highway motel. He begged for a tiny cash advance, promising to pay me back, claiming he needed the money just to buy a pair of insulated work boots for the freezing warehouse floor. I read the words feeling an incredible sense of detachment. The man who had forged my signature and attempted to sell my life's work to a criminal syndicate was now begging for spare change. I did not feel angry. I did not feel triumphant. I simply felt nothing for him. He was a stranger, trapped in the consequences of his own boundless greed. I did not type a reply. I tapped the screen, blocked the number, and deleted the thread. The closure was silent and permanent. An hour later, the doorbell chimed, pulling my attention back to the present. The evening was just beginning, and I was hosting a private celebration. I walked to the foyer and opened the heavy oak door, welcoming my guests into the warmth. There were no toxic society wives draped in borrowed jewelry. There were no arrogant heirs complaining about yacht club dues. The house filled with genuine, brilliant people. My lead engineers and research colleagues arrived carrying expensive bottles of wine. Jonathan, my corporate estate attorney, traded his usual formidable pinstripe suit for a relaxed cashmere sweater, laughing easily as he stepped inside. Valerie arrived shortly after, looking stunning in a tailored crimson dress. She embraced me warmly, her presence commanding the room without needing to diminish anyone else. As the newly minted star of the Grosse Pointe social scene, she had spent the last few months dismantling the old prejudices of the country club, reshaping the hierarchy to reward actual merit rather than dusty pedigrees. We shared a knowing smile, silently acknowledging the quiet war we had won together. The caterers circulated with silver trays of exquisite food, and the sound of authentic, joyous laughter echoed off the historic stone walls. I walked over to the tall leaded glass window near the fireplace, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. The heat from the blazing hearth radiated against my back, a perfect shield against the chill outside. I looked through the glass at the Michigan night. The remaining snow glittered under the moonlight, blanketing the sprawling lawn. I saw the faint, steady blue lights of the server room glowing through the reinforced window of the brick garage. The cold could no longer touch me. The parasites were gone, erased from the narrative by their own treacherous hands. I stood in the center of the beautiful, unshakable empire I had built, an empowered architect of my own destiny, finally at peace. The cold of a Michigan winter possesses a unique, unforgiving clarity. When the sub-zero winds sweep off Lake St. Clair, they do not negotiate with the architecture of the homes they batter, nor do they care about the pedigree of the people shivering inside. In the aftermath of my departure from the Tudor mansion, as the dust settled on the shattered remnants of my former marriage, I found myself reflecting not on the financial betrayal or the corporate espionage, but on the profound generational tragedy of how a mother systematically dismantled her own son. The story of Beatrice and Ethan is not merely a tale of a toxic mother-in-law and a cowardly husband. It is a devastating masterclass in the catastrophic failure of parenting, a cautionary tale about what happens when the fragile illusion of legacy replaces the hard, unglamorous work of raising a moral human being. In modern American culture, we are often seduced by the mythology of the self-made empire. Yet paradoxically, we remain deeply obsessed with the trappings of inherited legacy. We want to hand our children the world. We want to shield them from the bitter struggles we endured, providing them with polished lives, elite educations, and safety nets woven from our own bank accounts. But in our desperate rush to give our children everything, we often forget to require anything of them. Beatrice Henry raised her son in the absolute epicenter of Grosse Pointe's aristocratic bubble, a place where outward appearances were currency and social status was treated as a religion. She taught Ethan from a young age that the labels sewn into his coat, the crest on his country club membership, and the historic address of his home were the singular true measures of his worth. She built a gilded cage of expectations, and in doing so, she starved him of the very adversity required to build personal character. What Beatrice failed to teach him was the uncompromising value of honesty. She failed to teach him fairness. She failed to instill the emotional awareness necessary to navigate the world as a functioning, independent adult. When we look at traditional family structures, we often romanticize the roles the providing parent, the nurturing mother, the dutiful and respectful child. But a traditional family is only as strong as its foundation of truth. When that foundation is hollowed out by conditional love, love that is only dispensed when the child maintains a flawless, obedient facade, the structure becomes a trap. Beatrice did not love Ethan for the flawed, complex man he was. She loved him for the pristine prop he could be in her grand aristocratic play. And to keep that theatrical production running, she shielded him from every single consequence of his actions. When Ethan made financial mistakes in his youth, she quietly covered them up, teaching him that rules did not apply to his bloodline. When he demonstrated weakness or entitlement, she blamed the world around him, teaching him that he was perpetually a victim. When he eventually forged my signature and stole from his own wife, she did not reprimand his catastrophic lack of integrity. She merely demanded that he steal more to save her sinking ship. This is the ultimate unforgivable betrayal of family responsibility. True parenting is not the act of endlessly patting the corners of the world so your child never bruises. Long-term guidance requires the agonizing courage to let your child face the freezing reality of their own poor choices. Because Beatrice flatly refused to let Ethan experience small educational failures, she inadvertently engineered his total federal destruction. He grew into a man completely devoid of a moral compass, a man so emotionally stunted and paralyzed by the fear of losing his mother's approval that he willingly engaged with a criminal syndicate. He traded his soul, his marriage, and his freedom, all because his mother taught him that losing status was a fate far worse than losing his integrity. Raising children with genuine emotional awareness means teaching them that their feelings are valid, but their actions have undeniable, sometimes brutal consequences. It means demonstrating daily that true fairness is not getting whatever you desire simply because you carry a specific last name, but rather earning what you have through sweat, honesty, and diligence. If a family cannot sit together at a dining table and speak the harsh, unvarnished truth to one another, then they are not a family. They are simply hostages sharing a mailing address. The Tudor mansion was filled with expensive European artwork and blazing stone hearths, but it was the coldest place I have ever lived. It was entirely devoid of the profound warmth that can only come from honest, unconditional accountability. We share these profound, often painful stories on Grape Echo Stories because the shadows hiding in our own homes are rarely unique to us alone. If you have ever watched a family collapse under the weight of its own generational lies, or if you are fighting right now to break a cycle of toxic parenting and reclaim your own independence, I encourage you to join our community. Subscribe to Grape Echo Stories, hit the like button, and share your own journey in the comments below. We are building a space where the truth is finally spoken, where the facades are unapologetically torn down, and where we learn to rebuild our lives on foundations of absolute reality. As I sit now by the fire in my own home, watching the snow fall over the peaceful grounds, I am left with a thought that challenges everything we are traditionally taught to believe about blood and obligation. Conventional wisdom dictates that family is paramount, that a mother's love must be an endless protective shield, and that a child must always be offered a safe harbor, no matter the severity of their sins. We are told from birth that family means you never, ever turn your back on your own. But perhaps that is the greatest, most destructive lie we have ever been sold. Perhaps unconditional love, without unconditional accountability, is not love at all. It is simply sabotage disguised as affection. We do not owe our parents the sacrifice of our futures to cover their mistakes. And we do not owe our children endless, unearned rescues from the fires they intentionally set themselves. Sometimes the most profound, deeply loving act of parenting is not pulling your child out of the winter storm, but locking the door and forcing them to weather it alone. True love is the terrible willingness to watch someone you cherish fall, knowing that the freezing impact of the ground is the only thing that will ever teach them how to stand.